I'm sorry, Miss Pearson, but the Pearson Family Trust was liquidated 3 years ago. The authorized signatory withdrew the full balance. The words hit me like a physical blow. I gripped the edge of the mahogany desk, my fingernails digging into the wood as I stared at Mr. Delaney, my grandmother's longtime financial advisor. His office smelled of leather and expensive cologne, much like my father's study. That thought made my stomach turn. "That's impossible," I said, my voice tight. "My grandmother established that trust for me. It was supposed to become available when I turned 25. Mr. Delaney adjusted his glasses, uncomfortable under my gaze. The afternoon sun streamed through Venetian blinds behind him, casting stripes of light across his gray hair. He'd known me since I was a child, had watched me grow up at the country club and family functions. Now, he couldn't quite meet my eyes. The trust had a provision allowing for early withdrawal in case of emergency, with the signature of the designated trustee. He slid a document across the desk. "Your father, as trustee, exercised that option." I stared at my father's familiar signature, the loops and swirls I'd seen on birthday cards and school permission slips all my life. The signature that had just stolen my future. My fingers trembled as I touched the paper, as if physical contact might somehow change what it said. "How much?" I asked, the question barely audible. Mr. Delaney cleared his throat. The final balance was $3 million. The room seemed to tilt. I'd known there would be money. Grandmother had always assured me I'd be taken care of. But I hadn't known the amount. I'd been counting on it to finally break free from my parents' control, to start my own business, to build the life I'd been postponing. I'd already lined up meetings with commercial real estate agents to look at potential office spaces. I'd drafted a business plan. I'd even picked out the font for my company letterhead. "And what was the emergency?" I asked, finding my voice again. Mr. Delaney shifted in his leather chair. The documentation cited urgent family business investments requiring immediate capital. I asked for specifics at the time. He trailed off, his implication clear. My father hadn't provided details, and Mr. Delaney hadn't pushed. "Thank you for your time," I said mechanically, rising from the chair. My knees felt weak, but I wouldn't let him see me falter. "Miss Pearson, Eliza," Mr. Delaney called as I reached the door. For what it's worth, I advised against it. But legally, there was nothing I could do. I nodded once and left, the spring sunshine of Richmond, Virginia, feeling like a mockery as I walked to my car. The flowering dogwoods lining the parking lot of the financial center were in full bloom, their white petals drifting down like snow. My grandmother had loved dogwoods. She'd taught me their legend, how their blossoms formed crosses because they were said to have been used for Christ's crucifixion. "Even beautiful things have painful histories," she'd told me. My phone buzzed with a text from my father. "How did your meeting go, Princess? Dinner at the club tonight to celebrate your birthday." I turned the phone off and drove to the small apartment I'd been renting since graduating college, the one my parents constantly criticized as beneath me. The one I'd been planning to leave behind once I accessed my trust. It was a third-floor walk-up in a converted warehouse in Shockoe Bottom with exposed brick walls and plumbing that clanked at night. I loved it because it was mine, paid for with the salary from the job my father had so graciously created for me at his firm. That night, instead of joining my family at the Riverwind Country Club, I sat at my kitchen table with a legal pad, a bottle of wine, and my laptop. My dinner was a sleeve of saltines and some expensive cheese my mother had sent home with me after Sunday lunch last week. The irony wasn't lost on me, eating their food while plotting against them. By midnight, the legal pad was filled with notes, and I had the beginnings of a plan. The wine bottle was empty too, but my head was surprisingly clear. For the first time in years, I felt a sense of purpose that had nothing to do with meeting my parents' expectations. The Pearson family had always been a fixture in Richmond's social circles. My father, William Pearson III, ran the investment firm his grandfather had founded, while my mother, Catherine, chaired charity galas and garden club luncheons. We lived in a sprawling Tudor home in Windsor Farms, where sprinklers kept the lawn emerald green year-round, and a housekeeper named Alma had been folding my laundry since I was born. From the outside, we were the picture of old Virginia money. Respectable, generous, traditional. My father donated to the right campaigns, sat on the board of the art museum, and played golf with judges and bank presidents. My mother hosted fundraisers for children's hospitals while sipping vodka from a water glass, her smile never faltering as she wrote checks for other people's children while barely acknowledging her own. Inside our home, things were different. My father ruled with manipulation and cruelty disguised as high expectations. Nothing I achieved was ever quite good enough. My valedictorian speech should have been more inspiring. My college acceptance should have been early decision. My MBA should have come with higher honors. When I failed to meet his impossible standards, he wouldn't yell. Instead, he'd sigh deeply and say, "I suppose we can't all be exceptional," as if my very DNA had disappointed him. My mother drank too much Chardonnay and looked the other way. On good days, she'd slip me small rebellions, a forbidden novel, a secret shopping trip, a whispered "you're perfect as you are," when my father was out of earshot. On bad days, she'd lock herself in her headache room and emerge hours later with glassy eyes and fresh lipstick. And I, their only daughter, had been carefully molded to uphold the family image while having no real power of my own. I'd learned to speak softly, dress conservatively, and never, ever make a scene. I attended the right schools, joined the right sorority, and dated the right boys, sons of my father's friends, young men with old names and trust funds of their own. My grandmother had been different. Eleanor Pearson had built her own real estate empire alongside her husband's investments. She wore bold colors, laughed too loudly for polite society, and taught me to play poker when I was 10. She'd recognized something in me, a spark, a stubbornness, that reminded her of herself. She'd set up the trust when I was born, talking often about how it would give me choices she'd never had as a young woman. "You'll be free to make your own way, Eliza," she'd told me before she died when I was 16. "Don't let anyone take that from you." I'd failed her. I'd spent 9 years believing the money was safe, waiting for me. I'd endured my father's control, his loans that came with strings attached, his insistence that I work at his firm instead of pursuing my own interests, all because I thought independence was just around the corner. My plan started simply. I needed information, lots of it. The next morning, I called in sick to Pearson Investments, where I worked in the client relations department that my father had created specifically for me. I claimed a migraine, which wasn't entirely a lie. The betrayal felt physical, throbbing behind my eyes. I drove to the county records office, a brutalist concrete building downtown, where bored government employees processed paperwork under flickering fluorescent lights. I wore a plain blouse and jeans, my hair pulled back in a ponytail, as un-Pearson-like as possible. "Just doing some family research," I told the clerk as I requested all property records related to William Pearson III and Catherine Pearson for the past 5 years. The clerk, a middle-aged woman with impressive acrylic nails, raised an eyebrow. "All of them? That's going to be a lot of paper, honey." "I have time," I said, settling into a hard plastic chair with my laptop. That was just the beginning. Over the next few weeks, I became a ghost at work, doing the minimum required while focusing my real energy elsewhere. I requested bank statements from accounts I'd forgotten existed. I called in favors from college friends now working in banking, law, and accounting. I created a spreadsheet tracking unusual expenditures, property transfers, and unexplained cash flows. I wore bland, forgettable outfits to work and kept my office door closed, claiming allergies when anyone noticed my red eyes. In reality, I was staying up until 3 a.m. most nights, following paper trails and digital breadcrumbs that my father had carelessly left behind. The pattern emerged slowly. 3 years ago, around the time my trust disappeared, my father had purchased a lakefront property in Smith Mountain Lake under an LLC named Kingfisher Holdings. The price tag was $1.8 million. 6 months later, he'd bought a small airplane, a Cirrus SR-22, for $750,000. There were regular transfers to an offshore account in the Caymans and withdrawals that didn't match his known living expenses. But the most interesting discovery came from Lisa Chen, my father's executive assistant and my secret ally within the firm. We'd bonded years ago over a shared love of true crime podcasts and Korean skincare. She'd always treated me like a person, not just the boss's daughter. "I wasn't going to mention this," She said over coffee one morning at a small cafe 3 blocks from the office. But after what you told me about your trust, she slid a USB drive across the table. I've been keeping copies of some unusual correspondence. Your father's been moving client funds around in ways that don't make sense to me. I stared at the tiny drive. You're risking your job, I said. Lisa shrugged, tucking a strand of sleek black hair behind her ear. I've been looking for a reason to leave anyway. The atmosphere there has gotten weird. Too many closed-door meetings, too many nervous investors being reassured. I plugged in the USB drive that night. It was a gold mine. Emails showing my father had been using new client investments to pay returns to existing clients, fake account statements, doctored performance reports, classic signs of a Ponzi scheme running alongside the legitimate operations of Pearson Investments. My father hadn't just stolen my trust fund. He'd stolen it to prop up his fraudulent operation. I needed expert help. Through a college roommate, I connected with Maria Delgado, a former prosecutor now specializing in financial crimes. We met at her downtown office, where framed newspaper articles about her successful cases lined the walls. She wore a crisp pantsuit and asked sharp, direct questions that cut through my emotional haze. You understand what this means? Maria asked after reviewing my evidence, her dark eyes serious beneath straight-cut bangs. If you pursue this, your father will likely go to prison. I thought about the birthday dinner I'd finally attended a week late, where my father had lifted his glass and toasted to my princess, finally a real adult, with that smug smile that said he knew I'd never truly be independent. I thought about the countless times he'd implied I wasn't smart enough, strong enough, ruthless enough to succeed without him. I thought about my grandmother, who'd tried to give me freedom only to have it snatched away. I understand completely, I said. The next phase required patience. Maria helped me organize the evidence and connect with the right authorities, but we had to move carefully. I continued working at Pearson Investments, watching my father swagger through the office, treating employees like servants and clients like ATMs. He'd stop by my office occasionally, leaning against the doorframe in his bespoke suits, asking vague questions about clients I'd spoken with or commenting on my appearance. You look tired, he'd say. Maybe ease up on the late nights. He never specified what late nights he meant, but the warning was clear. He was watching. We need to talk about my future at the firm, I said during our monthly father-daughter lunch at Capitol Grill. The restaurant was his choice, always. He liked the power that came with being recognized, with having the maitre d' snap to attention when William Pearson III walked in. He cut into his steak, perfectly cooked medium rare. A thin line of blood pooled on the white plate. You're doing fine where you are, Eliza. Client relations suits you. I was thinking more involvement on the investment side. I do have my MBA. He chuckled, the sound both warm and dismissive. Let's be honest, sweetheart. You're not exactly Buffett material. Some people have the instinct, some don't. I could learn. I'd like to understand how everything works. I kept my voice neutral, interested. Like that Kingfisher account, for instance. His knife paused. Where did you hear about that? Around the office. It seems to be handling a lot of transactions. He studied me, then smiled. The smile didn't reach his eyes. It's just an administrative entity. Nothing interesting. He changed the subject, but I noticed he drank more than usual through the rest of lunch. That evening, I received an unusual invitation from my mother to join her for breakfast the next morning. We met at a small cafe far from our usual haunts, a place near the university where no one would recognize Catherine Pearson in her designer sunglasses and Hermes scarf. Your father mentioned you were asking questions about his business operations, she said, stirring her coffee endlessly. He seemed concerned. I'm just trying to learn the family business, I replied. She looked up, her eyes clearer than I'd seen them in years. Be careful, Eliza. Your father doesn't respond well to people getting too close to certain matters. What do you mean? She glanced around, then leaned forward. Your grandmother didn't die of natural causes. My blood ran cold. What? She was getting suspicious about some of William's investments. She threatened to remove him as trustee of your fund. She sat back. The medical examiner called it a heart attack, but she had just had a clean checkup the week before. Mom, are you saying... "I'm not saying anything," she interrupted. "Just be careful. Maybe let this go." But I couldn't let it go. If anything, my mother's warning made me more determined. I added a new layer to my investigation, requesting my grandmother's medical records and speaking with her former housekeeper, who remembered a terrible argument between my grandmother and father the day before she died. Meanwhile, Maria had made contact with the SEC and the IRS Criminal Investigation Division. Both were interested in the evidence we gathered, but needed more to move forward with formal investigations. "We need internal documents showing intent," Maria explained during a secure call from a burner phone she'd given me. "Something directly linking your father to knowledge of the fraud." The opportunity came during the firm's annual Client Appreciation Gala. The ballroom of the Jefferson Hotel was transformed with white orchids and champagne fountains, wealthy clients mingling beneath crystal chandeliers as a string quartet played. I wore a conservative black dress and pearls, the uniform of the dutiful daughter. While my father was giving his keynote speech about family values and financial integrity, I slipped away to his office with a small USB device that Lisa had helped me prepare. I took the service elevator to avoid being seen and used the keycard Lisa had borrowed for me. My father's office was a shrine to himself. Awards on the walls, photos with politicians and celebrities, leather-bound books he'd never read. I plugged the USB into his computer, and it automatically began copying files, a small progress bar the only indication of what was happening. As I waited, I noticed a framed photo on his desk that I'd never seen before. My father standing beside a blonde woman who wasn't my mother, both of them smiling in front of a beach house. His arm was around her waist, familiar and proprietary. She looked young, my age, maybe younger. I took out my phone and snapped a picture just as the USB finished its work. I was replacing the device in my purse when the office door opened. "What are you doing in here?" My father stood in the doorway, his bow tie slightly askew, a champagne flute in his hand. "Looking for a pen," I said, holding up a Mont Blanc from his desk. "Someone wanted your autograph." He stared at me, suspicious. "In my desk drawers? It was on top," I lied. "I should get back to the party." He stepped aside, but as I passed, he grabbed my wrist. His fingers dug into my skin, painful but not enough to leave marks. He was expert at that, causing pain without evidence. "You've been acting strangely lately, Eliza. Asking questions. Missing work. Is there something you want to tell me?" I met his gaze steadily. "Nothing at all, Dad. Everything's fine." "Good," he said, releasing me, because I'd hate to think my own daughter didn't trust me. The irony was almost too perfect. The evidence from my father's computer was damning. Emails explicitly discussing the movement of funds between accounts to cover losses. Documents showing he had personally directed the emptying of my trust to cover a shortfall when several large clients had tried to withdraw their investments simultaneously. Spreadsheets tracking the real performance of the firm versus the fictional numbers reported to clients. And there was more. Personal financial records showing multiple properties I'd never known about, including a house in the Cayman Islands and the beach house from the photo, which property records revealed was in Bald Head Island, North Carolina. Regular payments to the blonde woman, whose name appeared to be Vanessa Mercer. A quick social media search revealed Vanessa was 23, a former intern at my father's firm, now mysteriously employed as a consultant, with a salary that exceeded that of most senior executives. "This is more than enough," Maria said when I delivered the evidence. "The authorities are ready to move." The timing had to be perfect. The SEC and IRS wanted to coordinate their actions with the FBI, which had joined the investigation when the interstate nature of the fraud became clear. They would move on a Tuesday morning, showing up at Pearson Investments with warrants while simultaneously freezing accounts and seizing records. The Monday night before, my father called a family dinner. "Just the three of us," he said. "It's been too long since we sat down together." I considered making an excuse, but decided to go. It might be the last normal evening we'd ever have as a family, though there had never been anything truly normal about us. The dinner was at my parents' house, prepared by their longtime cook. My father was unusually attentive, asking about my work, my friends, my apartment. He poured wine generously, topped off my glass whenever it dropped below half full. My mother watched silently, picking at her salmon. "I've been thinking," he said as dessert was served. "It's time we talked about your future more seriously. I'm getting older, and the firm will need new leadership eventually." I nearly choked on my chocolate mousse. "Are you offering me a promotion?" "More than that." He leaned forward, his expression earnest in a way I'd rarely seen. I'm offering you a pathway to eventually take over. You're a Pearson, after all. The firm should stay in the family." My mother watched silently, her eyes moving between us. There was something like fear in them. "That's unexpected," I said finally. "What brought this on?" "I've been watching you. You've shown more interest lately. Asking questions, learning the systems." He smiled. "That's what I've been waiting for. Initiative." "And what would this pathway involve?" "For starters, moving you to work directly with me, learning how everything operates from the inside." His emphasis on everything was subtle but clear. Of course, it would require absolute loyalty to the family interests. He was trying to bind me to him, to make me complicit. If I agreed and then the fraud was discovered, I'd be implicated too. It was clever, protection disguised as opportunity. "Can I think about it?" I asked. His smile tightened. "Of course, but don't think too long. Opportunities like this don't come around often." As I drove home that night, my phone rang with a call from my mother. "He knows," she said without preamble. "I don't know how much, but he suspects you're up to something. Be careful, Eliza." "What did he say after I left?" "He made some calls. I heard him tell someone to move everything tonight. Then he started packing a bag." My heart raced. "He's running. It looks that way. I'm sorry, Eliza, for everything, for not being stronger." "It's not your fault, Mom." "Some of it is." She was quiet for a moment. "I've always known about the other women, the hidden money. I chose to look away because it was easier." Another pause. "I loved your grandmother. I should have said something when she died." "You're saying something now," I told her. I immediately called Maria, who contacted the federal agents. The timeline would have to change. They agreed to move immediately, obtaining emergency warrants based on the risk of flight. That night, federal agents arrested my father at Richmond International Airport as he was about to board a private flight to the Cayman Islands. They found him carrying 3 passports under different names and $250,000 in cash. The bland news article that appeared online the next morning didn't mention the scene he'd reportedly made, shouting about constitutional rights and demanding to call his lawyer as they led him away in handcuffs. I watched the news coverage from my apartment, numb as reporters stood outside Pearson Investments describing allegations of massive fraud and millions in client funds missing. They mentioned the cooperation of a family insider, but didn't name me. A former client was interviewed, an elderly man who'd lost his retirement savings, his voice breaking as he asked, "How could he do this to us?" We trusted him. The next morning, agents came to interview me formally, recording my statement about the trust fund and everything I'd discovered. I handed over all my evidence, including the material about my grandmother's suspicious death, which they promised to investigate further. By afternoon, my phone was buzzing constantly with messages from family friends, distant relatives, and Pearson Investments employees. Some were supportive, others accusatory. The Richmond social circles were already taking sides. I turned it off and drove to my mother's house. I found her in the garden, calmly deadheading roses as if it were any normal day. Her gardening gloves were pristine white, a stark contrast to the red blooms. She'd always treated gardening as a performance, like everything else. "Are you okay?" I asked. She straightened up, wiping her hands on her gardening apron. "Better than I've been in years, actually. Come inside. There's something I need to show you." In my father's study, she opened his safe with a combination I'd never known she had access to. Inside was a manila envelope labeled EP Trust Original Documents. "I found this years ago," she explained, handing it to me. I didn't understand what it meant at the time, but I do now. The envelope contained the original trust documents, showing that my grandmother had not only established the trust, but had included a provision that if the money was ever misappropriated by the trustee would forfeit an equal amount from their personal assets as penalty. "Your grandmother was smarter than any of us," my mother said. "She knew what your father was capable of." The provision was legally binding. With my father's fraud now exposed, his assets frozen and inventoried, there was a clear path to not only recovering my stolen trust, but doubling it through the penalty clause. 6 months later, I stood in the doorway of my new office in downtown Richmond, not at Pearson Investments, which no longer existed, but at Eliza Pearson Financial Advocacy, my new firm dedicated to helping fraud victims recover their losses. The office was smaller than I'd once dreamed of, but it was mine. Sunlight streamed through windows overlooking the James River. The walls were painted a soft blue, my grandmother's favorite color. My desk was second-hand but solid oak. On it stood a small bronze statue of Lady Justice, her scales perfectly balanced. My father had pleaded guilty to multiple counts of fraud, tax evasion, and money laundering. He was serving a 12-year sentence at a federal prison in Pennsylvania. The investigators had discovered that the Ponzi scheme had been going on for over a decade, with total client losses exceeding $30 million. Most would recover only a fraction of their investments. The investigation into my grandmother's death had been reopened, with inconclusive results so far, though the case remained active. The medical examiner who had signed her death certificate had retired under a cloud, his work on several cases being re-examined. My mother had divorced my father, sold the Windsor Farms house, and moved to a small town in Vermont where she was slowly building a new life for herself, sober and independent for the first time. She'd called last week to tell me she was thinking about opening a small bookstore, something she'd always wanted to do but had never dared while married to my father. And me? The court had awarded me $6 million, my original trust, plus the penalty. After setting aside funds for my mother and donating to organizations supporting financial literacy, I had enough to start my firm and truly build something of my own. I'd hired Lisa as my office manager. Maria had agreed to serve as legal counsel. Our first clients were former Pearson Investments customers who hadn't been able to recover their full losses through the official restitution process. My phone buzzed with a text from Maria. "Ready for lunch? First client meeting at 2 p.m. I took one last look around the office at the framed photo of my grandmother on the wall, her eyes kind but determined. "I didn't let anyone take it from me," I whispered to her. Then I grabbed my jacket and walked out, locking the door behind me. For the first time in my life, I held all the keys.